She had been swimming across this lake her whole life, knowing every shadow and every ripple on the water. But one day, the water level began to drop, and the roof of an old house rose from the depths. What she found inside turned her past upside down and revealed a truth that had been hidden for decades. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Mary Ellen's cabin, creating pale stripes across the wooden floorboards. She woke, as she always did, not to an alarm, but to the soft groaning of the old house warming under the first touch of sun. At 74, she had long since stopped rushing through her days. Everything she did now belonged to a slower rhythm, one that matched the whispering pines outside her window and the quiet breath of the mountains beyond them. She pushed herself up carefully, steadying her hand against the nightstand, and paused for a moment to gather warmth before stepping into the main room. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and the ashes from the previous night's fire still gave off a ghost of heat. She moved deliberately, as she always did, filling the kettle from the metal pitcher she kept near the sink, then setting it atop the wood-burning stove. The soft crackle of fire and the rising hiss of water were familiar companions. While it heated, she opened the front door and stepped outside. The air carried the crispness of autumn, that unmistakable scent of cold pine and wet soil. Leaves rustled across the porch, gathering in small piles along the railing. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and let her gaze travel down the slope toward the lake. From her porch, the lake looked like a shard of sky fallen into the valley. It had always been that way, still, reflective, a dark blue mirror cupped between the mountains. She had loved this view since the day she and her husband found this spot nearly half a century ago. He had built the cabin himself, plank by plank, while she cleared the land around it. He had passed 16 years back, but the cabin still carried the echo of his hands on every surface. Sometimes she felt him in the creaking of floorboards, in the neat stack of firewood he had organized for the last time, in the fading marks on the doorframe where they had measured seasons by carving small lines into the wood. Her tea finished brewing. She took it outside and sat on the porch swing, sipping slowly and watching the lake. It took her a moment to register what was different about it. The shoreline seemed larger. No, not larger. Exposed. She narrowed her eyes, letting them adjust to the ripple of morning light. Rocks she hadn't seen in years were jutting from the shallow edges. The waterline sat a foot lower than usual, maybe more. She frowned slightly. It wasn't unheard of for the dam to release water, but they never did it this late in the year. Autumn rains usually swelled the lake, not shrank it. She tried to dismiss it at first. Lakes changed. Seasons differed. The mountains had their own logic, their own patterns that humans only pretended to understand. Still, she found herself staring longer than usual, tracing the new shape of the shoreline and the faint streak of damp sediment that marked where the water once stood. Something felt off-subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in the tone of a familiar voice. After finishing her tea, she dressed warmly, gathered her small canvas bag, and walked down the winding trail toward the boat dock. It wasn't much, a pair of old planks tied to thick posts, but it had held up against storms and winters and time. Her wooden rowboat, faded to a soft gray from decades of sun, bobbed gently at the end of the dock. Rowing across the lake was part of her routine whenever she needed to check the small trail on the far side, the one that tended to flood or shift after rains. She had done so for years, like clockwork. As she pushed off, the oars dipped into the water with a soft, rhythmic splash. The lake felt different beneath her, lighter somehow, as if the water were thinner, the boat gliding a fraction faster. She looked over the side. The water was clearer than usual, She could see far deeper than she remembered being able to. The lake bed, normally hidden beneath murky greens, appeared in patches, like bruises surfacing through pale skin. She rowed slowly, letting curiosity rather than haste pull her forward. The sky was a pale blue streaked with thin clouds, and the wind barely stirred the surface of the water. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the silence stretching broad and unbroken. Halfway across the lake, something glinted to her left. At first, she thought it was just sunlight catching on a wave, but then it came again, a flash of something metallic, or maybe something wet. She turned the boat and rowed toward it, her movements careful, deliberate. As she drew closer, she realized the object wasn't floating. It was fixed, rising slightly above the waterline. Her heart began to beat harder, though she didn't understand why. The lake had never held surprises for her. She had known it intimately for decades. But now, as she approached the shape, her mind struggled to place it. When she came near enough to touch it with an oar, she froze. It was a roof. A roof. Not a piece of driftwood, not a broken dock, not a fallen tree. A peaked wooden roof, dark with age, slick with moss, the top of a chimney barely breaking the surface beside it. The edges of the shingles were warped, the lines imperfect, but unmistakably crafted by human hands. She gripped the oar tightly, her breath caught in her chest. Her first instinct was disbelief. How could there be a roof in the middle of the lake? She had lived here long before the dam was built. She had heard the stories, knew where the river once ran, knew that no houses had ever stood in this valley before the government had rerouted the waterway decades earlier. And yet here it was, a roof rising like a memory from the depths. She lowered the oar and leaned forward, peering into the water. Beneath the surface, she could see faint shapes, lines and angles, shadows of submerged walls. The lake was giving up something it had swallowed long ago. Her mind drifted back to her husband's stories from his time working near the dam construction site. He had never spoken of homes, only of land surveys, machinery, rerouted creeks, old forest clearing. His silence settled heavily on her now, as if it too was rising from the lake along with the roof. Mary Ellen sat motionless for a long moment, letting the boat drift slightly with the current. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet pine across the water, brushing her cheek like a whisper. She felt a tingling at the base of her neck, something that felt like both curiosity and unease. The roof before her wasn't only unexpected, it was out of place, impossibly out of place. She reached into her canvas bag for the small piece of chalk she carried for marking cairns and stones along the trails. She leaned over and drew a thin line at the very edge of the boat, directly in line with the exposed portion of the roof. If the water continued to drop, she wanted a way to measure it. Then she turned the boat around and began rowing slowly back toward her cabin. Her strokes were quiet, but her thoughts were loud. The image of the roof lingered, imprinted in her mind. She replayed every angle, every weathered crack she had seen. She couldn't shake the sense that something deeply personal was tied to that house, though she had no evidence, nor memory to justify the feeling. It was like a thread had been tugged loose inside her, hinting at an unraveling she could not yet name. By the time she reached the dock, the sun had risen high, warming the rough boards beneath her feet as she stepped out. But the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in her chest. She climbed the path back to her cabin, her pace slower than before, her gaze distant. When she reached the porch, she sat again on the swing, her hand still gripping the oar as if she had brought part of the lake with her. From where she sat, she could see the entire stretch of water, quiet and undisturbed, hiding its secret beneath the surface. The roof was too far away to see from this distance, but in her mind, it was clear as day. She knew she wouldn't sleep well that night. She knew she wouldn't be able to ignore what she had found. Something long buried was rising, and whether she liked it or not, she felt drawn to uncover it. The lake had shifted, and now something in her was shifting too. As the afternoon light softened into evening, she finally stood and stepped back inside. She closed the door gently behind her, but even with the lock turned and the fire crackling, she could not shut out the feeling that tomorrow would reveal even more. Something waited beneath that water, something that had not seen daylight in decades. And now that it had begun to surface, she felt certain it would not stop until the whole truth was visible. She had always lived quietly, without seeking mysteries or dramatic turns of fate. But mysteries sometimes found people anyway, especially in mountains, where the past never really disappeared. It only slept. Tonight, it felt as if the lake had opened its eyes. The night after Mary Ellen first saw the roof rising from the lake passed in restless fragments. She lay awake longer than usual, listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall and the slow sighs of the wind pressing against the cabin. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of that roof appeared with startling clarity, shimmering in the pale morning light, as if beckoning her to return. She tried to reason with herself, to treat what she'd seen as nothing more than an oddity, a curiosity carved out by time and weather. But the feeling that settled inside her was heavier than curiosity. It was as though the lake itself had reached out and placed something in her hands, something she was now responsible for understanding. By dawn, she was already out of bed, dressing in thick layers to fight the chill that clung to the autumn air. She prepared her small breakfast, though she barely tasted a thing. Her mind kept drifting back to the lake and to what might lie hidden beneath the murky surface. The mountains carried many stories, old ones whispered by wind, buried in soil, etched into bark. But this one felt different. This one felt like it had waited specifically for her. When the sun finally rose enough to bring a gray-purple glow across the valley, she made her way down the familiar path toward the dock. The lake was still in a way that made her uneasy, as if the water itself were holding its breath. She pushed the rowboat away from the dock and dipped the oars into the water, with the same measured movement she'd practiced for decades. The boat glided more easily now, skimming over the surface as if the lake had grown thinner overnight. As she approached the center of the lake, her pulse quickened. The chalk mark she had left on the side of the boat the previous day helped her measure the waterline. The change was clear. The water had dropped even further, by inches, perhaps more. And with it, the roof she had seen yesterday now rose higher, revealing a larger portion of what lay beneath. The shape of the house emerged slowly into clarity. The peaked roof, the chimney, sections of what must have once been a second story. Everything hinted at a full structure preserved like a silent witness beneath the lake. She stopped rowing and let the boat drift closer. The roof now glistened with a coat of drying moss, some of which had begun to crack and curl as the sun exposed it for the first time in decades. The shingles were warped, but many remained intact. Water dripped in slow beads down their slopes, forming small rivulets that trickled back into the lake. The sight stirred something in her chest, a quiet dread mixed with a strange tenderness. Homes were living things in their own way. They carried memories, held voices, sheltered lives. Seeing this one emerging from the water felt like encountering a ghost that had finally decided it no longer wanted to be forgotten. She eased the boat around the structure until she spotted what she had noticed the day before. The small, round window set into the uppermost part of the house. It was cracked and half submerged, but now the waterline had dropped low enough that the wooden frame stood exposed. As she drew closer, she noticed something else. Traces of paint, almost entirely washed away, but still visible in faint streaks of blue and gray. Someone had cared about this home. Someone had painted it, tended to it, lived in it, and yet no one had spoken of it for decades. She reached into her bag, feeling the reassuring weight of the rope she had brought. As the boat drifted beside the window, she tested the wooden frame with the tip of her oar. The wood groaned, but held firm. She positioned the rope around a nearby beam that jutted above the waterline and tied it carefully to keep the boat steady. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the solemn weight of what she was about to do. She thought of how long this house had slept beneath the water, untouched by people, untouched by time. To be the first person to enter it again stirred a kind of reverence, like stepping into a forgotten chapel. Taking a deep breath, she leaned forward, gripping the window frame with both hands. The wood felt cold and slick. It took effort, more than she expected, to hoist herself into the opening, but she managed it, swinging one leg inside and then the other. The smell hit her first. The soaked wood, the lingering mold, the bitter residue of silt that had settled on every surface. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior, revealing the slanted rafters of the attic above her head. The attic was small, cramped, and filled with the shadows of old objects. A metal-framed bed stood crooked against one wall, its mattress long since decomposed into clumps of rotting fabric. A rusted suitcase sat crushed beside it, its leather straps eroded. In the far corner, an old trunk leaned open, half filled with waterlogged papers and a tangle of fabric so deteriorated it crumbled when she brushed against it. Carefully, she moved toward a narrow set of stairs leading down. Each step moaned under her weight, threatening to give way. The beam above her creaked with a long, low groan, but it held. The further she descended, the colder the air felt, heavy with the damp weight of years underwater. The silence inside the house was different from the silence outside. It was thicker, oppressive, as though sound itself had become trapped in the walls and forgotten to escape. The lower floor was partially submerged, but the water had receded enough that she could stand on the remaining ledges of the staircase and peer into the interior. The outlines of furniture became visible chairs, a table toppled onto its side, the broken remains of a cabinet. Sunlight filtered in through cracks and warped boards, casting thin, trembling beams across the room. Her gaze drifted across the floor until something caught her attention. A wooden dresser stood along the far wall, its top drawer oddly untouched by the chaos around it. While the lower drawers had burst open from the water pressure, spilling their contents into the murky depths, this one remained sealed. She hesitated. The drawer was set high enough that the water wouldn't have filled it completely. Could something inside have survived? She waded through the water, careful not to disturb the unstable boards beneath her. Her fingers reached the drawer's handle. It was stiff, swollen from years of submersion, but it gave way with a long, sticky pull. As it creaked open, she felt her breath catch. Inside lay a metal container, small, rectangular, military in appearance. It was covered in rust, but intact. The edges were secured with the remnants of an old waterproof tape. The sight of it made her pulse quicken. She had no idea why, but she sensed immediately that this object mattered. She lifted it from the drawer, surprised by its weight. For something so small, it felt heavy, grounded, as if the decades beneath the lake had only strengthened its contents rather than eroded them. Holding it delicately, she climbed back up the stairs and made her way toward the attic window, glancing around the house one last time. She knew she would return, but she also knew that what she carried in her hands had shifted the meaning of her discovery. Back in the boat, she set the container carefully at her feet. She loosened the rope from the beam, letting the boat drift backward, before lowering the oars once more into the water. The lake seemed even quieter now, as though waiting for her reaction. She rowed slowly, the weight of the container pressing against her ankles, its presence reminding her of something she could not yet name. When she finally reached the dock and climbed out of the boat, she paused, looking back across the water. The house stood partially revealed, the sun catching the edges of its roof, casting reflections that made the structure seem alive. She felt no fear. Now, only a deepening sense of connection, as though she had pulled a piece of the past into the present simply by touching it. At her cabin, she placed the container on her kitchen table, staring at it in the soft glow of the afternoon light. She could feel the story inside it, dormant and waiting, like the house had been waiting. Part of her wanted to open it immediately, to unravel whatever truth it held. But another part of her whispered patience. She decided to wait until evening, when the fire was lit and the darkness outside shielded her from distraction. Hours passed before she sat again at the table, the fire crackling beside her. She wiped the rust gently from the container with a rag, revealing faint markings, initials perhaps, though too worn to read clearly. With careful fingers, she pried open the latches. The seal broke with a soft pop, releasing a faint scent of old paper and something metallic. Inside lay a stack of letters, each wrapped in a layer of oiled cloth. A small photograph rested atop them, showing a young man in a military uniform. His expression was calm, almost gentle, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. Beneath the letters lay a small jewelry box, and beneath that, a single envelope, separate from the rest, its seal intact, its paper still surprisingly smooth. The name written across it hit her like a second breath. It was addressed to her mother, and not with her married name, but with her maiden one. Mary Ellen stared at the container, at the letters, at the photograph, and felt the room shift around her as the pieces began to align. The house beneath the lake hadn't only held a secret, it had held hers, or rather, her family's. And now that the lake had surrendered it, she felt the quiet pull of destiny settling heavily across her shoulders. She closed the container gently, her fingertips lingering on the metal surface. Tomorrow, she knew, she would read every word. Tomorrow, she would descend even deeper into the story the lake had chosen to reveal. Tonight, she simply sat by the fire, listening to the wind as it brushed against the cabin walls, feeling the weight of the past returning to her, like a long-forgotten echo rising through the water. And for the first time in many years, she did not feel alone. The night settled over the mountains with a quietness that Mary Ellen had come to expect, but not a quietness she could fall asleep to. After discovering the container inside the house beneath the lake, her mind churned with possibilities, half-formed memories, and questions she could not yet articulate. She had never considered that her mother might have possessed secrets large enough to rise from the bottom of a lake, decades after her death. She had always known her mother as a reserved woman, one who rarely spoke about her youth. She knew there had been hardships, of course. Women of her mother's generation had lived through more than they ever let on. But Mary Ellen had never imagined anything like this, anything hidden so deeply that water itself had kept it sealed. She sat at the kitchen table long after the last embers glowed red in the stove. The metal container lay in front of her, now clean enough that she could see faint scratches from where the water had eroded the surface. Those scratches almost looked like writing, but when she tilted the box toward the lantern light, the shadows shifted and the markings blurred into nothing more than time's natural scars. She touched the container carefully, almost reverently, as if it might shatter under the weight of her fingers. It didn't. It had held its secret for longer than she had been alive. It would not break easily. She knew she needed to sleep before opening any of the letters inside, but sleep refused to come. Her thoughts kept circling back to the house beneath the lake, and to how impossible it seemed. She remembered the stories her husband had told her during their first years in the cabin. He'd been younger then, full of practical knowledge about construction and land surveying, working with the teams that built the dam. He had never once mentioned a house like this. In his stories, the valley had been nothing more than wild, land-rich soil, scattered stones, patches of old forest, where no one had lived for generations. But the house now rising from the depths told her a different story, and the letters inside the metal container promised another layer still. If there had been a home here, someone had lived in it. Someone whose life had been tied to this place long before it was swallowed by water. Someone who had loved her mother enough to pack letters carefully into a waterproof container. Letters that had never reached their intended destination. Before dawn, exhausted from pacing her own thoughts, she finally rested her hand atop the container and whispered an unspoken promise to open it in the morning. She blew out the lantern, climbed into bed, and lay listening to the creaking timbers of the cabin as sleep finally started to pull her under. When it came, it was filled with fragmented dreams, images of a submerged house, drifting leaves on the lake's surface, and her mother's face as she remembered it from childhood, looking both young and unbearably distant. When morning light brushed her eyelids, she rose without hesitation. She lit the stove, boiled water for tea, and gathered her courage before sitting back at the kitchen table. The container looked even more mysterious in the soft gray light of dawn. She unlatched it with deliberate care, opening the lid as though unveiling something sacred. The letters rested inside exactly as she had left them, bundled in oiled cloth, edges preserved by the waterproofing. She removed the first bundle and set it aside for later. The unsealed letters had been written over time. That much she could already tell. The handwriting varied, sometimes neat and flowing, sometimes hurried and slanted. But it was the final sealed envelope that drew her attention first. Her mother's maiden name was written across the front, in a style she didn't recognize. Careful, formal handwriting, the kind a man might use when writing to someone he loved and hoped to impress. She held her breath as she carefully broke the old wax seal. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, its edges slightly yellowed, but strikingly intact. The words written on the page were steady and full of quiet emotion. She began reading aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared breaking something fragile within the lines. He wrote of longing, of hope, of plans to return to the valley for a coming leave from his military post. He wrote of the house where he lived, the one that had been passed down through his family, the one he was preparing to renovate into something beautiful, a home worthy of her mother, though he didn't phrase it so directly. Instead, he wrote of what he wished she could one day see. The cleared garden where he had once grown vegetables as a boy, the small room he was turning into a library, the new windows he wanted to install before winter. The house had been old even then, but he wrote of it with pride and love. Mary Ellen paused, feeling the first prickle of tears catch at the corners of her eyes. Her mother had never spoken of a man like this. Her father, quiet, dependable, and older, had been her mother's only love story, at least as she had presented it. But now she knew there had been someone else. Someone her mother had never acknowledged aloud. And perhaps she had carried that silence for the rest of her days. She continued reading. He described the valley as it had been before the dam. How the air smelled differently in the mornings, how frost gathered along the tree line, how summers brought fireflies so numerous that a person walking through the fields felt as though they were moving through constellations. He mentioned wildlife, creeks that flowed in natural streams, and the faint echo of an earlier time when small communities had existed here before families moved away, or land was repurposed by the government. None of this aligned with her husband's accounts of the valley being untouched wilderness. The two versions of history contradicted each other, and she didn't yet know which one held the deeper truth. When she reached the final paragraph, her breath slowed. He had written the letter not long before his scheduled leave, mentioning that he hoped to reach the valley soon, that he had something important to speak with her mother about, something he couldn't bring himself to write but hoped she would accept. She didn't have to guess what that was. The last sentence, however, chilled her. He wrote that the valley was changing, that he had heard rumors of government plans for the waterway, that officials had visited his property. He didn't sound afraid, only uncertain. But something in his final line hinted at urgency. He wanted to return home as quickly as possible, before anything else changed. The date on the letter matched the year the dam construction had begun. When Mary Ellen finished reading, she set the letter down gently. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. It was something deeper, heavier, a realization that the past she thought she knew was incomplete, and that the woman she had called mother had lived with a quiet ache her entire life. She picked up the photograph next. The young man stood beside a weathered porch railing, wearing his uniform with a calm confidence. His gaze was steady, directed toward the camera with a softness that made her chest tighten. She found herself searching for familiar features, something that might link him to her mother, but the photograph revealed only his own distinct character. Strong jawline, focused eyes, a hint of a smile. Yet something in his expression felt strangely familiar, like an echo of an emotion she had seen in her mother's rare moments of silent reflection. Returning to the bundle of letters, she carefully unwrapped them, revealing more pages. These letters painted a fuller picture of a man she had never met. His childhood memories, his thoughts about leaving the valley to serve, his hopes of eventually returning to settle down and build a quiet life. With every line she read, she felt closer to him, closer to a truth she didn't yet fully understand. He mentioned her mother by name often. Her mother had answered these letters, it seemed, though none of her replies were present in the container. The correspondence spoke of shared memories, of a bond forged long before Mary Ellen had been born. They had known each other deeply. They had been young together. But then something changed. In one of the letters near the end of the bundle, he wrote about a delay in his leave, about storms that affected travel, about rising concerns among families in the valley as surveyors appeared on their land. He sounded determined to return despite the obstacles. The last few letters ended abruptly. There were no explanations, no final goodbye. The sealed letter had been his last attempt, and it had never reached its destination. The container, preserved inside a drawer of a submerged house, had held its silence until now. She sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of everything she had learned pressing gently against her chest. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was sadness layered with understanding. Her mother had loved deeply, and then something had happened, something that tore that love away and buried it beneath decades of silence. She tried to imagine her mother receiving nothing, hearing nothing, losing someone she cherished without explanation. That kind of loss could shape a lifetime. The room felt smaller now, filled with memories that weren't hers, but which she had inherited. She touched the medallion box next. Inside lay a delicate pendant, tarnished by time, but still bearing the faint gleam of something precious. She opened it gently. Inside was a tiny pressed flower, its petals, flattened but still holding their shape. She didn't know what kind of flower it was, but she was certain her mother would have known. A soft breeze moved through the cracks in the window, stirring the papers on the table. For a moment, It felt as though the cabin itself breathed with her. She closed her eyes and let a wave of emotion move through her. Grief for her mother's silence, compassion for the man who had written these letters, and a sudden sense of responsibility for carrying their story into the present. She looked at the lake through the window. Its surface shimmered in the mid-morning light, quiet and deceptively still. Beneath that water, the house still stood, bearing witness to everything she had just learned. Now that she understood the connection, she no longer felt fear or curiosity. She felt compelled to uncover the rest. She needed to know what had happened to the man who had written those letters. She needed to know why her mother had buried this chapter of her life so deeply that even her daughter had not glimpsed it. She carefully placed the letters back into the container and closed the lid, though she left the sealed letter on the table. She traced the handwriting of her mother's maiden name with the tip of her finger. The truth had not reached her mother in time, but it had reached her daughter. The past had risen from the lake to find the only person left who cared enough to listen. Now she had to decide what to do with the story she had uncovered. The morning was nearly gone when she rose from the table, carrying the container close to her chest. Today, she told herself, she would go into town. Today she would seek out records, archives, anyone who could confirm the history of the valley and the man whose letters she now held. The lake had given her a gift, but it had also given her a responsibility. She would see it through, not only for herself, but for the man who had waited beneath the water, and for the mother who had carried her silence to the grave. She stepped outside, the air crisp and bright, and felt the beginning of certainty settle over her. The story was not finished. It had merely begun rising. The morning after reading the final letter felt different from anything Mary Ellen had experienced in years. She woke not to the familiar stillness of her cabin, but to a subtle but undeniable sense of purpose. It was as though something inside her had shifted, aligning her with a path she had not known existed until the lake unveiled it. The letters had not merely opened a window into her mother's past. They had quietly reshaped her understanding of everything she thought she knew about the woman who raised her. As she dressed and prepared for the cold, hushed light of early morning, the container of letters seemed to watch her from the table, waiting for her next step. She knew what she had to do, though the thought stirred both apprehension and determination within her. By the time she stepped out into the cold air, frost clung to the branches like delicate lace. The mountain seemed swallowed in a muted gray haze, the kind that softened edges and dampened sound. She followed the narrow path toward the old truck she kept parked near the tree line. It had been her late husband's pride, an aging, square-shouldered machine that coughed and sputtered, but always came alive under her hands. As she turned the key, the engine shuddered before settling into a rattling rhythm. She placed the container carefully on the passenger seat, securing it with a folded blanket so it wouldn't jostle on the rough, uneven road she would take into town. The drive down the mountain was long and winding. The descending road followed the shape of the land, curving through stands of evergreens and over small wooden bridges that creaked with age. She had made this journey many times before, mostly for groceries, medication refills, or an occasional visit to the post office, but never with the kind of weight that accompanied her now. The container beside her felt heavier than its physical form warranted. It held the silence of two people, the man who had written the letters and the woman who had once been the intended recipient. And she felt as though she were carrying not just their story, but also something unresolved, something that had waited beneath the water for decades. When she finally reached the small town at the bottom of the valley, the morning light had brightened, though the air remained cold enough to numb her fingers as she stepped out of the truck. The town was modest, a few streets lined with shops, a diner that never closed, and a small brick building that housed the county archives. The building stood near the courthouse, its windows slightly fogged, and its door adorned with a faded sign noting its hours. She walked up the steps slowly, her breath clouding in front of her as she reached for the handle. The warmth inside the building enveloped her immediately. The room smelled of paper, dust, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from a back office. A woman in her 50s, with a tidy bun and glasses perched on her nose, greeted her from behind the main desk. She had a gentle face, lined with years of reading small print and helping townspeople trace their histories. When she saw the container under Mary Ellen's arm, her expression shifted from polite welcome to genuine interest. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. Mary Ellen took a steadying breath before replying. She explained that she had come looking for records related to the valley, to the years before the dam had been built, and to a young man whose photograph and letters she now held. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, not from nervousness, but from the enormity of what she was finally putting into words. The woman listened patiently, nodding with understanding, and then guided her to a small reading room at the back of the archive. The air there was cooler, the light softer, the shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes. Over the next several hours, they sifted through files, land surveys, old property maps, lists of families who once lived in the valley before the government relocation notices were issued. As the woman pulled out documents, Mary Ellen traced the lines on the maps with trembling fingers. Where the lake now lay, there had once been a cluster of homes, small dwellings, farmland, even a few businesses. The valley had not been an untouched wilderness after all. It had been a community, a place where people lived and loved and built their futures. Her husband had not lied to her. He had simply not known. He had worked on the dam, but long after the valley had been cleared of its final residents. The homes had been razed, or so the records said. But one home, the one that now stood half exposed in the lake, must have slipped through the cracks. Perhaps its owner had refused to leave until the last possible moment. Perhaps he had died before he could. Perhaps water had risen faster than expected. There were no documents that explained the fate of the man whose letters she now held, but a single line in an old report mentioned a missing resident who had never been accounted for after the evacuation. The woman at the archive grew quiet as she read over the files. She looked up at Mary Ellen with a sympathetic expression. "This must be important to you," she said. Mary Ellen nodded. She could feel the truth of the valley's history settling heavily into her bones. Now that she had seen maps, dates, and notes in official handwriting, she realized how tragic the story truly was. Her mother had fallen in love with a man whose home had disappeared from the surface of the world, and she had never spoken of him again. The letter he had sealed had never reached her. Whatever answer her mother might have given had been swallowed by silence. Before leaving the archive, Mary Ellen left scans of the letters with the clerk, not to publish, not to share broadly, but simply to ensure the valley's story was preserved somewhere it belonged. She wished to keep the originals, and the woman understood, assuring her that the copies would be stored respectfully in the family history section. The sky was grayer when Mary Ellen stepped outside, the air tinged with the threat of rain or early snow. She carried the container more securely now, as though it had become a part of her. She drove back up the mountain in thoughtful silence, watching clouds gather along the peaks. By the time she reached the top, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, tapping lightly against the windshield. When she reached her cabin, she placed the container on the porch before walking down the path toward the lake. The rain had grown steadier now, blurring the edges of the trees and softening the shapes of the mountains beyond. As she neared the water, she felt her breath catch. The lake's surface had begun to rise again. The storms of the night before had fed into the rivers, and the lake was reclaiming what it had unveiled, Where the roof had stood proudly only days earlier, now only the peak remained visible. She walked along the shoreline until she reached the spot closest to the submerged house. The rain blurred into mist against her skin, cool and wet. She watched as the water pushed upward, inch by inch, swallowing the roof in slow, deliberate movements. Each small rise felt like the closing of a chapter she hadn't known needed closure. She stood very still, letting the rain soak into her clothes. She felt neither sadness nor relief. She felt something more profound: acceptance. The story she had discovered was not hers to change, but it was hers to remember. As the water reached the chimney and began to cover it, she removed the medallion from her pocket. The delicate pendant felt warm from her touch, the tiny pressed flower inside, holding the memory of a love she had never witnessed. She whispered softly into the rain, her voice carried away by wind and water alike. "I know now. Your story didn't disappear." She let the silence stretch before she closed her hand around the medallion once more. She didn't place it in the lake or throw it away. Instead, she brought it back with her up the path. Some stories were meant to rise only once, and then to be carried forward by those who understood them. Inside the cabin, she dried her coat and lit the stove. She placed the medallion on a small wooden shelf near her husband's photograph. It seemed to belong there, not replacing him, not overshadowing him, but adding to the quiet fullness of her life. She felt the presence of those who had come before her: her mother, the man who had loved her mother, her husband, and realized that her own solitude had shifted into something gentler. The storm outside grew heavier, rattling the windows and sending a rhythmic patter across the roof. She sat by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the flames dance. She was no longer the same woman who had rowed across a quiet lake only days earlier. She had stepped into the past, uncovered a truth that had lain buried beneath decades of water, and allowed it to settle within her without fear. When she finally rose to look outside, the lake was once again smooth and whole. The house had disappeared entirely beneath the surface, leaving no trace of its brief return. She felt no urgency to visit it again. Some doors closed naturally, with the same quiet grace that had opened them. Mary Ellen returned to her chair, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The past had risen, and now it had returned to the water. But she carried its truth with her, carefully, respectfully. She reached for a small notebook and began to write, as she had not written in years. Not to retell the story in its full details, not to share it with the world, but to honor the lives that had entwined with her own through the unexpected kindness of the lake's shifting depths. Outside, the rain softened, turning to a delicate mist that clung to the window panes. The mountains breathed quietly, the wind settled, and the house beneath the lake slept once more, wrapped in the cold embrace of the water. But Mary Ellen did not feel alone. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Watch the next videos and explore the others on the channel. Share this video with someone who would enjoy it.